I'm very proud to be able to call Ja la Makhzoumi my friend. I met her first in 2016 in Panama. She's from Beirut originally, now lives in London, a landscape architect, and we're really happy to have her here. Jala, please come to the stage.
Hi, David. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to join, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. And thank you for that beautiful start, perceptions too. Amazing, amazing. So food for thought. So I'll share my screen. Okay, so what I wanted to talk about is really the experience of the nature and natural heritage and natural landscape in the city of Beirut. I will start with a quotation from Scott Atran's book on the cultural construction of nature. He says that people's behavior towards the natural world is surely conditioned in part by their ways of knowing and modeling it. And that is exactly the case in Lebanon, where the focus of my study is, basically. So in Lebanon, when you talk about nature, people immediately think of the mountains, of cedar forests, amazing cedar forests, but nobody would consider the city as part of nature, as there is any nature in the city. Beirut, the capital in this image, is not has no nature. And in a way that is true, because there is less than a meter square per capita in a city of 1.5 million in Beirut. It's also correct because people no longer see nature, and it is the way they model nature and they see it. And this is very much what I will talk about. Before I go into that, I will take you to a very sad event which helped us in addressing this issue of what is nature in cities. And this is the explosion, the Beirut blast of August 2020, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of. It was one of the largest non-nuclear explosions in the world. And the destruction to lives and property was phenomenal. And it affected very much everything, really, lives, conceptions, and part of this is heritage. So I will be talking a lot about heritage, natural heritage, but in general, also heritage. So UNESCO, as part of its effort to identify cultural heritage, because if you look to the map on the right, the epicenter of the blast was very close from the historic parts of the city, and these are the neighborhoods that were affected most. So UNESCO came up with a project of identifying cultural heritage attributes in Beirut blast damaged areas. The project was funded by UNESCO in collaboration with the Ministry of Culture in Lebanon, and the work was commissioned to the Beirut Urban Lab in the American University of Beirut. And I was one of many specialists that worked on this fascinating project. Before we go into the project, let's look at the city, because I said that there is no nature in the city. How could there be no nature? So Beirut, historically in the map from the 19th century, is a headland that juts into the Mediterranean defined by the foothills. So it's almost triangular in shape. It's defined by the river, Nahar Beirut, the Beirut River, and the Ghadir River in the south. There was a large pine forest encircling the city. And the small square is the walled medieval city. In the image, the map to the left, you can see the successive rings of growth, of urban growth, that overtook all of those features that we're talking about. Go very quickly through it. this is once more. So we asked, what is nature? How do we look for nature? What is nature in, so that we can look at natural heritage? And these are some of the maps we constructed. This is the walled city you can see in the main map. And the dotted area is the affected, the project site, the neighborhoods that we were surveying. And you can see the key map on top. So the medieval city, there was, of course, no gardens or nature in the medieval city because it was all around the walls. So all around were orchards, mainly mulberry orchards, because the silk industry was really the basis of the economy then. There were also olive and carob groves all over, and paths. And apart from a few cemeteries and some monasteries and religious buildings, there was really nothing. So people just left the city to go out to nature. Eventually, buildings spilled out of the walled medieval city. As you can see, there are no longer walls, and spilled into the surroundings. And dirt paths became streets. And this is the road to Tripoli. And gradually, nature was, displaced by buildings and by human habitation. Of course, by the 60s, by the 50s and 60s, there was very little left of that landscape that we talked about, the verdant orchards that surrounded the city. And the rest was mostly built, not as built as it is today, but it was really, it is very dense. So in our definition of nature, we said that there are really two natures. There is the nature of the city of Beirut, which includes the topography, the coastline and the river, and other water sources, and of course, vegetation, whether agricultural or spontaneous. And that is really the base that has been more or less covered and overtaken. But as this was covered, a lot of it was enclosed in domestic gardens and in institutional gardens, in churchyards, in cemeteries, in university campuses and colleges. So in a sense, it didn't go away. So our search was really two parallel lines, looking at what has been hidden and blanketed by the city, by the urban fabric, but also what remains. And we looked at also the methodology we applied, looked at UNESCO definition. It's very interesting that for the first time we applied the UNESCO HUL approach, historic urban landscape. And the minute you introduce landscape, the dynamics change. You're not just looking at buildings and at urban fabric, you're looking at a total. So that also helped us with defining what nature is and what natural landscapes are. We had to do periodization to look at the different eras and the transformation in the morphology, the built morphology, but also building typologies. And lastly, I will talk about values and attributes. And again, this is very important. How do you value nature? The research was undertaken under consultants like myself, by students. Here is Serge Yazaji presenting with a group of graduate students and who undertook the research. We had GIS maps and everything was georeferenced, the surveys that we ended up with 2,464 surveys were completed. A lot of them of the built heritage, but also many of domestic gardens and gardens, institutional green areas, but also of streets. The findings, as you can see, in a way represent the typologies of nature and green areas. Predominantly, it's the traditional house garden, which is a detached house surrounded by gardens. The villa garden, which is Western-inspired typology. Very little remains of the orchards, just one large orchard of mulberry and olive from those early maps that I showed. It's the only one, and it is now protected. And the rest is modern apartment buildings and apartment buildings that are not modern, pre-modern. So they also have. And then you can see those typologies that I've just mentioned. This is the Tubaji garden. It's an incredible terraced garden because remember the topography. So there are stairs and the city sort of cascades down to the port, which you can see in this slide. There are traditional house gardens in the bottom left. And there are the villa gardens with the Sursu garden, where the garden was decanted of its vegetation, mainly productive vegetation, and to be replaced by lawns and ornamental trees. And there are the apartment buildings. Then there are green and open spaces, which are also we call institutional gardens, municipal garden, educational. This is the campus of AUB. There's also cemeteries. And for example, a large pocket of nature is the abandoned train station infrastructural landscape. So we look at the different values that we have. How do we value nature? How do we value those green areas? And this was really difficult. And you can see the table. The top part is the architecture heritage. It's the bottom part that I will focus on. So you can see that the first column is the actual landscape gardens. How gardens represent a historical period. We looked at typology, distinctive features, hardscape, softscape, condition, and integrity. How much was changed? How much did it change? Would it still be considered heritage? The next part was looking at the urban context. So we asked how gardens and green spaces contribute to urban landscape character and identity. Garden space, position in the site, position in the city, accessibility. Some are not accessible, but they spill over. Some of the trees in houses spill over the streets, so they have a role. So we looked at all of these roles and as we did the survey. Then there is the social and cultural value. The role of gardens and green spaces to the people and communities inhabiting the neighborhoods, to the memory of the place. We introduced one column which was specifically for nature and for landscape, and that is the environmental value. Because unfortunately, I mean, all of those values were pursued in the survey, but the one that is most tangible and can be objectively measured is really the environmental value, in a way. So we looked at how gardens and green areas contribute to the urban microclimate and to urban biodiversity. Each large tree is a habitat. So this is really very interesting because, first of all, nobody had noticed those gardens and those green spaces. I mean, they were there, they were just there, but they were not valued. And when I say valued, I mean they were valued by the communities that inhabit the place, but by professionals and by the state, by institutions, not so much. So we looked at also the social I think we mentioned. So we looked at socio-spatial practices, and you can see we have marked them on the map. We have children play area, community gatherings, reading, religious practices like little shrines and areas for sitting, informal and formal. This was a very important part of the survey. We also went around in urban walks, which we called them, to look at these practices firsthand and talk to the people. Then there is also, I think we saw this, then there is the environmental aspect. You can see here a gradient of green. Here we're looking at the tree height, but the tree height is really a sign also of maturity. So you look at maturity and density, and by calculating the canopies, then you can look at their impact, whether as biodiversity habitats or as for climate. So this is more or less what we did. What happened to the study? The study was handed in January, finalized, and now is in the process of being approved and formalized so that it can be adopted by various agencies. Now, apart from formalizing and institutionalizing these findings, what is very important is that the process, we had town hall meetings, we met with professionals, we met with government agencies, we had meetings with government agencies, and in the process, a lot of them admitted, and of course, colleagues, architects and urban designers, a lot of them admitted that they had never really considered this aspect of Beirut. And so in that sense, I think it was a very, very successful study to look at nature, the value of nature, to look at it, to value it, but also to find ways of identifying it and deciding how to go about managing and protecting it. So I go back to the first thing I started with, ways of knowing and modeling nature invariably informs how they come to be valued, and similarly, how we can shape them as heritage. Thank you. If there are any questions, I will stop sharing.
Yes, thank you, Jala. Fantastic. There's some chats already there's some things in the chat already about the notions of you bringing together different natures and into a single unified vision. And a couple of things that I wanted to ask. One, Deborah Leipziger asks in the chat whether you in the study and in the concept of this integration, no, I'm sorry, this was Hidi. Do you take into account things like noise or other kinds of elements that disrupt the city in nature in a certain way? And also, if you might talk about the idea of rare species and habitat for individual species in this way.
Actually, no. It was very, very short, the time span. It's incredible we managed to do what we did. It's a first step, but noise didn't go into it. Species, yes, because in identifying traditional gardens were productive species, whereas the more contemporary green areas are ornamental species. So species were identified as much as possible. But noise was not taken into account. One other aspect that taken into account, again physical, was the topography. So there were special recognized garden typologies with terraces because of the edges, and urban features like stairs, community stairs, which were socializing spaces and important. So these features were singled out, but there's a lot that has to be, done. But as I said, this is a base study. But what is valuable is that those blast affected neighborhoods, what was studied there will apply to rest of Beirut. I mean, it's not specific to that. So in that sense, it is good. But in the sense that it was very short-term study, there's a lot that has to be done.
And what would you do next?
You know something, it's very important. It's not I mean, okay, I showed you, there is nature, we showed percentages, we discussed typologies. In the end, what really counts is scientific evidence. And what I would like to do is go back to that environmental assets, because unfortunately, in much of the global South, it is environment that is recognized, environmental impact that is valued, and environment that can be measured. So I would go to those tree canopies and try to convert them into the language of science to see how they operate as habitats and how they serve us as microclimate, and even assess their social impact, but mainly the environmental. This is something I would like to do, because then, unfortunately, that would be irrefutable. Whereas the other studies, I mean, it is not all of the valuation criteria are important, but these are the ones that administrators and governments will look at more closely and more seriously.
Yeah. As you imagine the Beirut of the future, there's a question here from Joaquim about the idea of maintaining, as we envision Beirut, but maintaining something about the heritage and structure of Beirut as it is, or as it was, or do you imagine recreating something new, a novel environment for a new Beirut? Which is the direction, do you think, or both?
It depends on what you mean by creating. I mean, if you're creating as in replacing, no. But if you are creative in how you see the future of the city, yes, you will have to repackage a lot of what I have shown. I mean, those traditional green areas, you have to repackage them. You have to network them. You have to put them together so they are of value. You cannot just leave them like that on a survey. So I would really, that would be and there is the Plan Vert, the green plan for Beirut, and a good colleague worked on that, Habib Tibis. So there are such efforts. So putting the two together, I think, would create a new Beirut that is aligned with the 21st century, just as it recognizes its historical heritage, its past heritage.
A beautiful way to end. Thank you very much, Ja la Makhzoumi. Thank you so much for that story, Beirut. There's a lot of stuff in the chat that you might want to interact with.
I will. I promise.
By what you had to say.
Thank you, David. Thank you.